Hey everybody, this is Jeff Ishee in Mount Sydney, Virginia. It is Thanksgiving Day 2025, and I had a couple hours to spare before the big family gathering this afternoon, and I thought that I would repeat a recent presentation that I made in Dayton, Virginia on weaving the story of your family's history. I had a live audience there in front of us at the Rocktown History facility. If you are not familiar with that facility, it is located in Dayton, Virginia. It is a nonprofit organization and it is a wonderful resource if you're researching genealogy in the Shenandoah Valley, specifically in Rockingham County. But wanted to repeat this, and that would allow a lot of people to see my presentation that I made on weaving together the story of your family history. So let's go ahead and move forward with this. And you know, I've been told that the first thing every presenter should do is start off with a joke. And I have to confess that I'm a lousy joke teller. Everybody knows that. I just simply I don't have the rhythm. I don't have the cadence. It takes a skill and a lot of work to make a joke work. And I'm just really not good at telling jokes. But what I can do is tell a pearl of wisdom. This is something that I've been doing on the radio program for 30 years now. It goes way back to the studios of WSVA in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Jim Britt and I were live on the air one morning, and after I had completed my morning farm report, Jim asked me on the air, well, let's conclude with a pearl of wisdom. And I just looked back at him with a blank stare as if to say, what is a pearl of wisdom? And he went on to explain, it's a one-liner. It's something maybe that one of your parents or grandparents or maybe an old, a coach or a mentor, maybe a teacher or grandparent, somebody said something one time that really got your attention. Essentially, it's a one-liner, very short, brief, to the point, but it gets your attention. So with at that point, we put out a request to our radio listeners to send in pearls of wisdom, and they came in by the thousand. And to this day, I have kept all of those in an archive, and we have an accordion file that is probably 2 feet thick with all those pearls of wisdom that were sent in by our radio listeners. And one of my favorite pearls of wisdom was submitted by a listener in Harrisonburg, Virginia. His name is Jim Bishop. He is now deceased, but Jim Bishop says, I want my kids to grow up and have everything that I couldn't afford, and then I want to move in with them. And that is one of the best ones that I've ever seen. And God bless you, Jim Bishop, and rest in peace. And thank you so much for sending in not only that pearl of wisdom, but dozens of pearls of wisdom over the years. So, the title of my presentation was Weaving the Story of Your Family's History. And it's about, I'm trying to, inspire people to pass along what they do know about your family's, line, your genealogy, because if you die with that knowledge and you have not shared that knowledge, all of that dies with you. So that was the title of my presentation at Rocktown History on November the 20th of 2025. Now, this leads to tell me briefly, I'll share the story about the two recent books that I wrote in 2023 and 2025. What was it that inspired me to write two books about my family's history? Two Sacks, One Family's Journey from Swiss Germany to America in 1803 to 1805. That came out on December the 1st of 2023. And then my most recent book, Magnolia Frontier, The Search for Land, Liberty, and Love, came out on November the 1st of 2025. And what this is my goal was to tell my family's story, why they came to America, a good plausible reason of how they came to America. I had researched the genealogy for years and years and years, and I wanted to share that information with my grandkids and anyone else in the family that wanted to know that story. Now, of course, every family, most families I would assume, have a family legend. And in my family, this was passed on to me by my Aunt Sarah Kinslow Ishee. She was the wife of my dad's brother, Cecil Lamar Ishee. And she told me, and everybody else in the family kind of told me, that the family what legend was that there were three brothers who left Germany in the early 1800s and they came to America, and their names were John, Jacob, and Fred. Now, their last name, currently it's spelled Ishee, but before they came to America, it was spelled all sorts of ways, as you see on the screen here. Ische, Ishi, and on and on and on, even Issue, as in issue, or many other spellings, but the name did eventually end up in the mid-1800s to become Ishee in the United States. And the family legend went on to say that John and Jacob, two of the three brothers, they eventually settled in what we now know as Mississippi. But Fred moved north to Ohio and was never heard from again. So that was the family legend. No documentation, but that was the story. So I started researching genealogy roughly 20 years ago, my family's history, and I would spend evenings on Ancestry.com and Family Search, and I would be looking for anybody named John, Jacob, and Fred, any kind of spelling of Ishee or any derivation thereof. And one night I was going over ships' passenger lists that entered the harbor at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this was a ship by the name of Commerce. And on October the 9th of 1803, that ship entered the harbor at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they were required to provide a passenger list. And this is one page of that passenger list. And there you will see passenger number 83 is Johann Ishee, Ische. And right below him is Hans Jacob Ishee. And two lines down, there's Frederick Ishee. Holy mackerel, have I found them? I think I found them. After years of searching and searching and searching, here was this document right in front of my eyes that had John, Jacob, and Fred Ishee. Could it be another family? Well, figure the odds. John, Jacob, and Fred on the same, evidently in the same group on a ship, and their last names were exactly how my Aunt Sarah said it may have been spelled, Ische. But behold, there's not just three of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 9 people in this group, and that absolutely took my breath away because I didn't suspect this. Nobody had told us this, that there may have been more than the 3 brothers in this original group of immigrants to the United States. But starting there with passenger number 81 was Ulrich Ishee and Barbara, his wife, and then there was Johann or John Ishee, Hans Jacob Ishee, Maria Ishee, Frederick Ishee, Barbara Ishee, and then Hans Ulrich Ishee and Elizabeth, his wife. But my big question is, how are these people related? And if so, how are they related? And it took me years to get the answer to that, but this was the thing that changed everything when the family legend went from 3 original immigrants to this group of 9 that were on the same ship at the same time. Now, if you notice in the middle column there, it says cabin or steerage, and it lists steerage for everyone. I researched the name of the ship, and it was Commerce, and the captain was Nathaniel Ray, who was a New England whaler. Once again, they arrived in the port of Philadelphia on October the 9th, 1803, and there was roughly 200, I believe it was just over 200 passengers on this immigrant ship. Most of them were what we call German redemptioners. And brief explanation of redemptioners, kind of like of indentured servitude, where you agree with the captain of the ship that in return for free passage on the ship to the United States, you will sell a contract with your labor to someone in the United States. The captain is compensated with that money, and then you're indebted to serve anywhere from 2 years to 5 years, as a redemptioner or indentured servant. So I did my research on the ship and I found out a lot of information. And then if you'll notice the final column to the right, quantity of baggage. And what does it say? Right there beside immigrant number 81, Ulrich Ishee. 2 sacks. That was their quantity of baggage for 9 people. And it literally kept me awake at night for several weeks just trying to figure out. Number one, this told me a lot. They were not wealthy people. They were most likely peasants. They were paying their way across the Atlantic Ocean with the redemptioner method or indentured servitude method, and they came with everything they owned in 2 sacks. And that kept me awake many a night wondering what in the world would you pack in 2 sacks for an entire family of 9 people. I'm thinking just their shoes would take up that much room, but that really kept me awake, and it was so interesting. And that 2 sacks, of course, was the title of my first book. Eventually, over a period of years, I was able to piece together who the people in this group were, and indeed it was one family. There was a set of grandparents, a set of parents, and there were 5 children. The children ranged in age from 18 down to 2 years old. The grandparents, Ulrich and Elizabeth, they were 66 and 69 respectively. The parents were Yulie and Barbara, both 41 years of age. And everything that I found put it all together that this indeed was one family traveling together in 1803 to follow their dream of coming to America. So what was my goal in telling this story? I wanted to share this information, and along this research, I found a whole lot of data, a lot of numbers, birth dates, death dates, marriage certificates. I found land certificates. I found all sorts of data, but there really was no story, and that was what I wanted to pass along to the next generation. I wanted to create a plausible story of historic fiction that told why this family came to the United States. The United States was so young, only 25, less than 30 years old, and I wanted to tell how that journey may have occurred. Once again, I'm going to go back to one of my favorite words, plausible. I wanted to create a story that was believable, but not overly dramatic, that took all of the facts that we knew and wove those facts together into a plausible story. And you can see here on the bottom of this slide, the journey goes all the way from Canton Bern in what we now know as Switzerland. At that time that they left, it was known as the Helvetic Republic, but they followed the Rhine River all the way up to Amsterdam. That was the second largest port in Europe after London. But a lot of the folks from the main part of Europe, they departed through Amsterdam, and then they came all the way across the Atlantic. They entered the United States at Philadelphia, and then they went down what we call the Philadelphia Great Wagon Road, as far as it went back in the day, and then they continued on to what we now call the state of Mississippi. At that time, it was called the Mississippi Territory, and I go into the first book, the plausible reasons why they were destined for Mississippi. So the question came up, how do I tell this story? You know, there's a lot of different ways to pass along your family history. The most common way is through a scrapbook. And a scrapbook is literally what it sounds like. You take scraps of information and you paste it or tape it into a blank album. And it contains vital records, old photographs, maps, and maybe a few written anecdotes. You can also do an audio recording. And I've considered doing this since I have all the equipment to do that and tell it oral style, what I had learned in my research in the family genealogy. Or you can do a documentary book. Now, there are dozens and hundreds, perhaps thousands of families that have done a documentary family history book, and that contains ancestor profiles, timelines, short stories, factoids. It's all put together with footnotes. You can tell a lot of research goes into a documentary, but it's presenting all of the facts that they have learned about their family history. The next possibility was a new word to me, novella. I had to learn what a novella was, and essentially it is a very short novel, generally less than 100 pages, less than 40,000 words. And short, it's a short story that's longer than usual, or a long story that's shorter than usual. But a novella was a possibility, or I could do the ultimate challenge for a writer, and I could write a novel about my family's history. So another question came up, and that was the question of what is historical fiction? That genre had always perplexed me because if something is historical, it's true, it really happened. But if something is fiction, that means it didn't happen. So how can you have something that is historical fiction? I never really understood the genre. So I decided, at the encouragement of my wife Carol, to look it up. And here's what I found. According to Merriam-Webster, a historical fiction refers to a novel that is set in a past period that typically includes historical figures and events. It is a work of fiction that is based on history and often involves an imaginative reconstruction of past events and people. So now I'm starting to warm up to this genre. Maybe that would be the correct way to tell the story of the Ishee family and their migration to the United States of America if I could do it in historical fiction with a novel. So I asked my wife, give me some examples of historical fiction. What are some good examples? And she said, duh, Jeff, how about Gone with the Wind? You know, that was probably the most popular historical fiction, perhaps of all time. It was an authentic setting with realistic, plausible people wearing the appropriate costumes and the appropriate foods, and all the events surrounding the story. They were real, but the story itself was fiction. It was made up. And now I'm really starting to warm up to this. And she gave me some other examples. To Kill a Mockingbird, The Caine Mutiny, The Great Gatsby, A Tale of Two Cities. And, historical fiction has been a thing for a long, long time, and I was really starting to warm up to this genre. My goal was to use the format of historical fiction to tell, again, my favorite word, a plausible story of how our family ancestors came to America. I'm not saying it happened exactly like this, but I'm saying based on the facts that we have learned, there's a good chance it may have happened like this. So now I'm really starting to warm up to historical fiction. When I set out to write the book, I did, however, intentionally leave out all of the standard ingredients of a popular novel. Every popular novel has a plot, it has rising action, climax, resolution, it has all these characters, protagonist, antagonist. I didn't want any of that, and I didn't want to create villains or heroes, and I didn't want any unnecessary drama, any racy sex scenes or crimes of passion. I did not want to write a popular novel. I wanted a story that my grandkids could read and appreciate. That is what I set out to do. And then I had to consider my point of view. Well, when I'm writing this, am I writing this in first person? In other words, am I a character in the story and all of the sentences begin with I? Well, that's one way to tell the story. Then there's third person limited. And that's when the narrator is outside the story but focuses on the thoughts and feelings of only one character. And then the method that I ended up using is called third person omniscient. Don't you love that word? That's a beautiful word. It means you can see everything. It's an all-knowing observer who can access the thoughts of any character and provide external commentary. And I thought that that was the best way to do the historical fiction that I intended to write. Now, I know it's bad manners to read something word for word off of a slide, but I'm going to do this because this is the actual preface from both of the books. This is technically from the second book, Magnolia Frontier, but I want to read this word for word because I want you and I want the readers to understand how I'm writing this story and why I'm writing this story. Dear reader, I fully realize that I'm repeating my advice from the first book in the series, Two Sacks, One Family's Journey from Swiss Germany to America in 1803 to 1805. It is, however, worth repeating, in my opinion, the most important message I need to convey before you begin reading this book is found in the first two sentences of the next paragraph. This book, Magnolia Frontier, The Search for Land, Liberty, and Love, is a work of historical fiction. That is, fiction based on historical facts. The narrative within these pages is completely my own imagination. My intention is to tell the story of the Ishee brothers as they settled in the Mississippi Territory in the early 1800s. It may have happened this way, or it may not have happened at all like this. It is doubtful that we'll ever know the real story. And this is the primary reason for this novel. It's my attempt to tell a story, to weave a narrative based on the customs of the period and the few facts that we have learned. I wanted the readers to understand a lot of things. I wanted to feel like they were actually there alongside my ancestors when they were journeying from the old Helvetic Republic or Switzerland to the United States. I wanted the readers to understand the culture of the times, the political and the social issues, and believe me, the early 1800s, especially the first decade of the 1800s, there were a lot of political and social issues. For instance, and I'll tell a quick story here about how President Thomas Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Territory. It's called the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and that is exactly the year that my ancestors arrived in America. So there was a lot going on, but quick story here. Thomas Jefferson, well, first of all, the Louisiana Territory was owned by France, and we wanted it. We wanted it bad for the United States, but the issue was really the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Thomas Jefferson understood that whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the Mississippi River, and whoever controls the Mississippi River ultimately will control all of North America. And he was absolutely right. So he created a delegation and sent them to New Orleans to negotiate with Napoleon Bonaparte the purchase of the city of New Orleans, and Thomas Jefferson authorized that delegation up to $10 million to purchase the city of New Orleans and a little bit of what we call West Florida. But the main intent was to get a hold and get control of New Orleans. So this delegation goes to New Orleans and they begin their negotiations and they make their offer. We would like to purchase the city of New Orleans, and our president has authorized us up to $10 million. They told him the price right up front. And so communication in those times was very slow. You had to send couriers by horseback, and it would take weeks to get an answer. So they had couriers go to wherever Napoleon Bonaparte was, and then they had couriers go back to Jefferson. But to make the long story short, the French came back to the American delegation and they said, "We'll tell you what, if you'll make it 15 million, we'll give you the entire Louisiana Territory. All of it, all the way up to the Canadian border. It can be yours for $15 million. Well, they sent couriers back to Washington, D.C., and Thomas Jefferson, I don't know the full story behind this, but I expect it took him about 10 seconds to say, "Deal. You got a deal. We'll pay you $15 million and we'll take the entire Louisiana Territory." And so word got back, the deal went through, but this was very controversial. Congress almost ousted President Jefferson over this. You think President Trump is controversial at times. Thomas Jefferson was quite controversial himself. Congress accused him of almost treason. They said, "Here, who authorized you to go off and spend taxpayers' money, congressional money to buy new land for our nation? You cannot do that unilaterally. You can't do that single-handedly. That's illegal. Our Constitution does not allow that. This would have to be authorized by Congress." And they really, Jefferson was in a lot of trouble for making this agreement with Napoleon Bonaparte. Long story short, the deal did go through. Jefferson, yes, he was in hot water for a while, but you know what his comeback was? 3 cents an acre. Yeah, we had just purchased 530 million acres for the United States of America, and Thomas Jefferson just wagged his finger in everybody's face and said, 3 cents an acre. And the deal did go through. So I digress, but that's a great story if you want to research the Louisiana Purchase. But there were a lot of also social issues of the time. Of course, slavery was the huge elephant in the room in the United States in the early 1800s. You know, so many people disagreed with this. People agreed with it. I mean, there were a lot of fence sitters. It was a huge social issue. Food, dress, and language of the times. I wanted the reader to be so immersed in the culture that they felt like that they were there. I wanted the readers to understand what their ancestors' lives may have been like. Now, that's enough about why I wrote those two books, Two Sacks and Magnolia Frontier. I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about how you can share your own family's story. There are a lot of blank journals out there that are designed to help you do exactly this. This one is called a prompt journal. If you open it up and see the interior pages, there's a place for, a small family tree. You can put in all of your personal information, your spouse's personal information, the marriage. You can talk about your jobs, your children's names, the date of birth. You're recording basically your life in data format. There's not a lot of room for storytelling here, but with these prompt journals, you can share a lot of data. This one was given to me by my sister several years ago, and this is one good example of it's essentially a scrapbook, but I'll call it a prompt journal. The next way you can do your family history and share it with future generations is through a documentary family history. And this one was researched by a distant cousin of mine. His name is John Z. Ishee, and I believe he lives in Texas, but I'm not 100% certain of that. But 12 or 15 years ago, I was researching my family history, and somehow I found a note from a John Z. Ishee, and I found his phone number, and I called him up one night. We had never met before and have never talked since, but had a great conversation with my distant cousin John Z. Ishee, who told me that yes, he also had been researching our family history, and he had actually gone to some of these locations in Switzerland and Philadelphia and New Holland, Pennsylvania. He had gone to several of these locations in his research, and then he sat down and wrote a documentary family history. And it is, I'm going to guess, between 80 and 90, perhaps 100 pages long. Excellent information. John, thank you. You did a lot of work. But one thing John told me, he said, please, Jeff, don't share this information with anyone else. I'm considering it copyrighted because at some point in the future, I may want to do my own book about the Ishee family history. So I ask of you not to share this with anyone else. And John, I have kept that promise. I have not shared it with anyone outside a couple of random slides like this just to illustrate the research that you did back in the early 2000s. And his research was incredible. He actually went to Switzerland and found some old census data that listed all of the Ishees that were in these the community of Oberpip and Rumisburg. There are two small farming villages in Canton-Bern, Switzerland, and he went there and he found this census from 1798 that listed all the Ishees in the community along with their occupation. And I found that fascinating. The occupations, as you see at the bottom of the slide, a landman is a peasant farmer, a decker is a roofer, a sin is a cheesemaker, a wobber is a weaver, and just really good information. It kind of gives you a little bit of glimpse into the culture of that community. And to this day, Rumisburg is a small farming community in Switzerland. And as a matter of fact, I'm not sure if it still is in effect, but about 5 years ago, the mayor of Rumisburg, Switzerland, was last name Ishee. So we're still there. Great work, John. Just incredible work to find this information. And then John wrote a timeline. This is what the family was like in the back as far as the 1600s and then the 1700s, and then he followed it through the 1800s, the 1900s, right on into the 21st century. Lots of great information in this documentary, and that is one way that you could tell your family story, is by documenting all this information into one volume. And here's the final way, is through what I call a scrapbook. And this particular scrapbook is the one that started my journey into becoming a family historian. This particular scrapbook was started by my aunt, Sarah Kinslow Ishee, probably in the 1960s or maybe in the 1970s. And then as she would learn information, as she would gather old photographs and information, she would include that. And of course, this is pre-computer. So she would sit down at a typewriter and she would type up all this information, and it was called the Ishee McCord Family Tree. She created this version in 1979, and then she listed some of the people that helped her with this information. But this is a scrapbook, and you can do this with handwriting, you can do this with drawings. There's just a lot of different ways. It's literally a blank slate, and you can do whatever you like in a scrapbook. This is another one of the pages that Aunt Sarah did, and she included some photographs that I would call, now those photographs are priceless, at least to me and my extended family members. Great old photographs. I had no idea what my grandparents looked like. They had passed away before I was born or when I was very, very young. And then my Aunt Sarah, I didn't know this at the time, but she was training me to become a family historian. The table on the left-hand side, I recognize my handwriting. That is all my handwriting when I was about 13 or 14 years of age. And I can remember we were down at the Department of Archives in Montgomery, Alabama on one Saturday. I was about 13, maybe 14 years old. And another quick short story. My mother passed away from cancer when I was 15. She was a young woman, and it was not a good situation at home. Her health declined very rapidly, and I suspect that my Aunt Sarah got me out of the house to go with her down to the Department of Archives and do some family research, just to get me out of the house and to get my mind on other things besides what was going on within my own family. But God bless you, Aunt Sarah. You did indeed inspire me to become a family historian. But I recognize this handwriting. She sat down with me with a blank form and she said, "Now, Jeff, we're going to fill this out and you're going to fill in all the blanks. And I've got most of the information that you're going to need right here." And she started with, the name of my grandfather, Benjamin Franklin Ishee, who was the son of John Jefferson Ishee and Martha Webb. And then we went right on down the list. And my handwriting there, evidently this took a couple of hours of work to put together, but God bless you, Aunt Sarah, for instructing me on how to do this. It was, looking back, I just greatly appreciate it. This old scrapbook had a lot of wonderful old pictures. Here is my great-grandfather and great-grandmother on my father's side. This is John Jefferson Ishee and Martha Elizabeth Webb Ishee. And if we research back in her line of the tree, the Webb family, I found so many interesting stories. In fact, one I'll share briefly is that one of her ancestors was in the Revolutionary War, and he served as a bodyguard for Colonel George Washington. Yeah, this is way before the Secret Service, but there was a company of troops that was assigned to physically guard. I said Colonel. I think he was General George Washington. But when you look at the roster of those troops, there he is, one of my ancestors. Boy, the stories he could probably tell. But this was helping to bring the family history to life. Another couple of great pictures. This is on my grandmother's side, John Duncan McCord, Olivia Parker McCord, and just great pictures. So now the final segment that I want to talk about is a family history journal. Not a scrapbook, not a documentary, but a family history journal. And I'll preface this by saying that this was a gift to me and all of my immediate family and the grandkids and so forth. Everybody got a copy of this. And she titled this The Recollections of Joe Q. Ishee. His full name was Joe Quitman Ishee. Throughout his life, he was known as JQ. JQ was my dad, and these are his entries in this journal. She gave him this journal when he was in his elder years. His health was declining, but he was still in fairly good health. And she said, Dad, why don't you sit down and just as soon as you finish breakfast every morning, why don't you just answer the question at the top of every one of these pages? And this was not a huge book that she gave to him. It was maybe tablet size. And at the top of every page was a prompt or a question such as this: what are your early memories of your mother? And then he would write 3 or 4 paragraphs that answered the question. What characteristics did you inherit from your father? In what ways did you take after him? Your physical appearance, personality, and so forth. And then he would do this. He did all this in 1991, which was several years before he passed away. And then my sister took those handwritten notes and she would transpose those on a computer and then print it out in plain text so we could all easily read it. Dad's handwriting was not the greatest in the world, but this is one of my favorite stories. Dad bought a used 1924 Ford Model T. It cost $50 and was the first car my family ever owned. It was 4 years old when we bought it, and we kept it just a short time. Nobody knew how to drive it, so I never got to ride in it. James, and that is his older brother, James bought a 28 Chevy 4-door about 3 years later, and he and I learned to drive with it. Our family took trips of 15 to 25 miles in it. One time we went to Lewin, Mississippi, but it had 7 flat tires from Lewin to Bay Springs. Now, folks, that is in Bay Springs, Mississippi. Those two communities are not far apart. I'm going to guess it's less than 10 miles. So they had 7 flat tires in a very short distance. This is where family history comes to life. This is so much more than census data and birth certificates and pictures of gravestones. And so this is where family history really comes alive. Another one of the great stories, and then there's a book full of these. Thank you, Beverly, for doing this with Dad. He told about who his father was. His grandfather was a Baptist minister and a sharecropper. That was John Jefferson Ishee. He told about where they lived. He talked about the family. He talked about the family education. He went on down to cover, the physical condition. He died at the age of 78 while living with May at Panama City, Florida, and is buried in Lewin Cemetery, Mississippi. But all of this provides a lot of information. And of course, this is Dad never did any research that I'm aware of. This is all memorized or oral history. And another great story, quick one. I have an old horse collar and harness that my horse wore when I was farming. I also have an old Seth Thomas clock that had stopped running years earlier that Vera, his wife, Vera's mom and dad gave to me. I had it fixed in 1960 for $1, and it still runs good this day. And here it is 2025, and my wife Carol and I still have that same clock. I never knew the story behind that clock. I grew up with it in my bedroom, and it chimed every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, and it was my job to wind that clock. And I never knew the story behind that, but now I do. Another great story, a dad talking about, well, guys like to talk about cars, right? And one thing Beverly did with these, when she assembled this family history journal, she went to an old archive, a shoebox full of old photos, and she tried to match up an old picture with the story that my dad was telling. And in this picture, I'm going to assume that my dad was in his early 20s. He said, my first car was a 1936 Chevy four-door knee action. It was 3 years old when I bought it for $325. I sold it 7 years later for $450. Now, J.Q. Ishee was a businessman. I'll have you know that. That was a thing he did often. He would acquire things, it would appreciate in value, then he'd sell it. But he went on to tell the story about that, how this was the car that they had when they got married, and they made many, many trips in that car. I'm going to assume this is somewhere around 1941, probably 1942 or very early 1943. So that is what you can do with the Family History Journal. And as I conclude this presentation, I want to suggest some prompt journals that I found online at Amazon.com. There are literally dozens of these prompt journals that you can do. It only takes a few minutes a day. Starting with the one on the left, there's a grandmother's journal, memories and keepsakes for my grandchild. The next one is Mom, I Want to Hear Your Story. It's a mother's guided journal to share her life and her love. Then there's a lifetime of memories. And finally, over on the right-hand side, Tell Your Life Story, the Write Your Life guided journal. And these are just some quick examples of one that I have found at Amazon.com. I'm sure there are dozens of titles available, but I would really encourage you to consider this way. It doesn't take a lot of time, and you can pass on your family history to the next generation. And in conclusion, I want to encourage each of you, please don't let your family's history die with you. Pass along what you know in whatever format you choose. It can be with a scrapbook, it can be with a documentary, it can be an audio recording. You can do what I did, which is the most challenging. You can write a historical fiction novel, and now that has become a series with two historical fiction novels, and I suspect that there will be another one, maybe even a couple more, who knows. But I'm trying my best to tell my family's story in a plausible manner where I take all of the known facts, and then around those facts I piece together or I weave a story that is believable, that is not overly dramatic, but it's something that a young person would be interested in. So that is the reason that I wrote those two books, and I would encourage you to do whatever format you choose, but please don't let your family's history die with you. And that concludes my presentation that I made to Rocktown History in November of 2025, and I want to thank you for your time. God bless you.